The hallway was crowded, buzzing with the usual chatter of students, some heading to class, others gathered in small groups, gossiping and laughing. But amidst the noise, Aisha's world felt eerily silent. Every step she took felt heavier than the last. Her heart beat faster, faster, too fast, like it was about to escape her chest. The weight of the school uniform, the tightness of her hijab, the ever-watchful eyes, they all felt suffocating today. She adjusted her backpack as she passed through the hallway, her eyes scanning the lockers, the walls, the other students. They moved around her in a blur, but Aisha felt like an outsider in her own skin. Her world had become the hallway, the endless trek between classes, the cruel whispers that followed her every time she entered a room. And then, she heard it. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. One whisper, followed by a laugh. A mockery, subtle but cutting. It came from behind her, but she didn't need to turn around to know where it came from. Sarah, the self-appointed queen bee of the school, and her sidekick, Emily, were never far behind. "Terrorist," Sarah said, loud enough for Aisha to hear. "Ugly." Aisha's steps slowed. She bit her lip, tightening her grip on her bag. The words didn't surprise her. They were the same words she'd heard countless times before. Every day, every hallway, every class, the bullying followed her like a shadow, and the cruel whispers echoed in her ears long after the bullies had moved on to their next victim. But today was different. Today, she could feel something shifting within her. Something she couldn't quite place. She continued walking, pretending she hadn't heard, but the sting was sharper than usual. The weight of their words pressed on her chest. It wasn't the name-calling that hurt anymore. It was the feeling of being invisible, being reduced to a stereotype, being defined by something she couldn't change. Her faith. Her skin. Her name. She walked faster, her breath becoming shallow as she neared the door to her next class. As she reached for the handle, a hand shot out, blocking her path. "Where do you think you're going, Aisha?" It was Emily's voice. It was laced with mockery, a slow, deliberate insult. Aisha froze, the hand on the door still gripping the handle. She hadn't expected this. Not now. Not today. But when she turned, her eyes met Sarah's, the ringleader. Her icy blue eyes narrowed in a smug, knowing look. "Don't you ever get tired of being so different?" Sarah's tone dripped with disdain. "What, you think wearing that thing on your head makes you special? Makes you a martyr or something?" Aisha's face flushed. She knew the drill. Sarah always had something to say about her hijab. Always. It was like the target on her head, the thing that marked her for ridicule. But this time, Aisha wasn't going to let it slide. She didn't say anything at first. She couldn't. The words were stuck in her throat, choked by the years of humiliation. But something inside her was rising, swelling like a tide, and it felt different. Stronger. Like something had awakened deep within her. Aisha's gaze dropped to the floor for a moment. She could feel the sting of tears threatening to form, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. Not when she finally felt something stirring, something she had buried for so long. She took a slow, deliberate breath and lifted her head, meeting Sarah's eyes once more. "You think you know me," she said, her voice low but steady. "You think you can break me with your words. But you have no idea who I am." There was a silence, a moment where the world seemed to hold its breath. Sarah blinked, her arrogance faltering for a fraction of a second. But only for a second. "Please," Sarah sneered, waving her hand dismissively. "What, you're going to tell me you're some kind of fighter now? Or are you just going to keep playing the victim?" Aisha didn't flinch. She didn't react the way Sarah was expecting. Instead, she squared her shoulders, standing taller than she ever had before. "I don't need to prove anything to you," Aisha said, her voice firm now. carrying a weight of defiance she hadn't known she had. "But you're right about one thing. You don't know who I am." Sarah's smirk faltered slightly, but it was quickly replaced with her usual sneer. "You should be careful, Aisha. People like you don't belong here." It was a threat, thinly veiled, meant to make Aisha feel small. But she didn't feel small. Not anymore. "I'm not afraid of you," Aisha said, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. The words hung in the air, heavier than she expected. "I'm not afraid of any of you." The bell rang, signaling the start of class. The moment was over. Sarah sneered once more and walked away, her friends trailing behind. But Aisha stood frozen for a moment longer, her hand still on the door handle. She had said it. She had stood up for herself in a way she had never done before. And it felt like a victory. But as she walked into the classroom, she knew that the fight was far from over. The whispers, the mockery, the cruelty, they wouldn't stop just because she'd spoken up. But maybe, just maybe, it would be different now. Maybe she could finally be more than just a target. Maybe she could be something more. As Aisha took her seat, she felt the weight of all the eyes on her. The whispers followed her into the classroom, and she could feel the coldness of their stares. But she didn't flinch. She sat up straight, her back stiff with defiance. She wasn't going to let them win anymore. But then came the next blow. The one that would shake her to her core. The teacher, Mrs. Jensen, walked in and went to the chalkboard. She seemed to sense the tension in the room, but her eyes flicked over Aisha with a glance that felt all too familiar. "Aisha," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet. "I need to speak with you after class. It's about your behavior today." Aisha's heart sank. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had just stood up for herself. She had just spoken her truth. But in that moment, Aisha realized something. The world around her wasn't ready to accept her strength, her defiance, her identity. And maybe, just maybe, this battle wasn't just about surviving high school. It was about surviving a world that didn't understand her. And she was ready. Ready to fight back. The next day felt different. The air in the school felt heavier, almost as if the walls themselves were pressing in on Aisha. She didn't know whether it was the anticipation of Mrs. Jensen's meeting or the echo of yesterday's confrontation, but everything seemed just a little too loud. The clatter of lockers, the murmurs of gossip, even the steady hum of the classroom, it all felt overwhelming. Aisha could still feel the heat of Sarah's eyes on her as she walked into school that morning. There was no doubt that the ringleader of the bullies hadn't forgotten the words she had spoken yesterday. But now, Aisha had something different inside her. It wasn't anger. It wasn't resentment. It was something deeper, a quiet, unshakable strength that seemed to grow with every step she took. But then came the reminder that this was far from over. As Aisha passed by the usual group of girls by the lockers, Sarah gave her a pointed look. She didn't say anything this time, but the silent message was clear: the battle was only just beginning. Aisha didn't react. She kept walking, head held high. No matter how much Sarah tried to push her down, she wasn't going to break. Not again. When the bell rang for first period, Aisha headed toward her classroom with a mix of anticipation and dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. And she wasn't wrong. As she opened the door, she was greeted by Mrs. Jensen's stern gaze. The teacher's eyes were fixed on Aisha for a brief moment before she motioned for her to come forward. Aisha's stomach twisted into a knot, but she stood tall. There was no turning back now. "Come here, Aisha," Mrs. Jensen said, her voice softer than usual but still carrying a weight of authority. The class was already settling down, and Aisha could feel the eyes of her classmates on her. Some looked curious, others judgmental. But she didn't let that sway her. She walked up to Mrs. Jensen's desk with steady steps. As soon as she reached the desk, Mrs. Jensen motioned for her to sit in the chair in front of it. I need to talk to you about yesterday, she said, her tone now cool and impersonal. You've been acting out in class, and I'm concerned. Aisha blinked, confused. Acting out, she repeated, her voice betraying her disbelief. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just defending myself. Mrs. Jensen sighed, clearly exasperated. Aisha, you have to understand that there are ways to handle conflicts. What you did yesterday, standing up to Sarah and the others, it only caused more tension. We can't have that kind of behavior in my classroom. Aisha's chest tightened. She hadn't expected this. Not from Mrs. Jensen, of all people. The teacher had always been the fair one, the one who seemed to look out for students like Aisha. But now, it felt as though everything had shifted. Mrs. Jensen wasn't on her side after all. I'm not trying to cause trouble, Aisha said, her voice quiet but firm. I just don't want to be treated like I'm invisible. Like I'm nothing. Mrs. Jensen's expression softened, but only slightly. I understand that you feel hurt, Aisha. But you have to learn how to handle it with grace. You can't let your emotions control your actions. Aisha's hands clenched into fists on her lap. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't let the anger rise. Instead, she forced herself to speak slowly, deliberately. I'm not going to sit back and let people walk all over me anymore. I'm done being quiet. Mrs. Jensen looked at her for a long moment, her gaze searching. Then she nodded, albeit reluctantly. I'm going to give you a warning this time. No more outbursts. Understand? Aisha nodded stiffly, but she felt a wave of frustration wash over her. It wasn't fair. She wasn't the one who had caused trouble. It was Sarah, it was Emily, it was all of them who had made her life a living hell. But here she was, being scolded for standing up for herself. Mrs. Jensen turned away and started to speak to the class, dismissing Aisha with a wave of her hand. But as Aisha walked back to her seat, she couldn't help but feel a sense of injustice. The world wasn't ready to accept her for who she was. Not yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Every class felt like a battlefield, and every hallway seemed to stretch on forever. But there was one thing that kept her going, one thought that stayed at the forefront of her mind: she wasn't going to let this break her. No matter how hard it got, no matter what came next, she was going to stand tall. At lunch, Aisha found herself sitting alone in the corner of the cafeteria. She didn't mind. It wasn't like she had a choice. The other girls wouldn't sit with her, not after everything that had happened. They wouldn't want to be associated with the girl who stood up to the popular crowd. But then, as she opened her lunchbox, something caught her eye. Across the room, Sarah and her friends were huddled together, whispering and laughing. Aisha couldn't hear what they were saying, but she knew they were talking about her. She could feel it. And then, without warning, Sarah looked up and met Aisha's eyes. Aisha didn't look away. She didn't flinch. For a moment, the room felt silent. The world seemed to stop turning as their eyes locked. And then Sarah smirked. Her eyes flickering with something that wasn't amusement. It was a challenge. Aisha felt her heart race. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. But as the lunch period came to an end and she headed to her next class, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was building. Something bigger than just the everyday insults and taunts. Sarah wasn't going to let it go. Aisha could feel that in her bones. As she walked into history class, her mind was racing. But when she sat down, she was caught off guard. Mrs. Jensen had walked into the room with a small envelope in her hands, and her eyes were scanning the class. When her gaze landed on Aisha, it didn't waver. She motioned for Aisha to come to the front. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. What now? Mrs. Jensen handed her the envelope. You've been selected for the school's peer mediation program. I think you need it, Aisha. Aisha blinked in confusion. Peer mediation? She had heard of it, but she didn't understand why she was being picked. She had no interest in sitting down with the people who bullied her. Yes, Mrs. Jensen said, her voice quiet but serious. You need to learn how to work through your anger and frustration. This is an opportunity for you to find a better way to deal with conflict. Aisha stood frozen for a moment, her mind reeling. She wasn't the one who needed fixing. It was Sarah and the others. But Mrs. Jensen was insistent. Take it. It's your choice, but I think it could be good for you. With the envelope still in her hands, Aisha returned to her seat, the weight of the teacher's words pressing on her chest. The rest of the class was a blur as she sat, her mind in turmoil. What was she supposed to do with this? As the bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Aisha gathered her things. She wasn't sure if the peer mediation program would help, but one thing was certain, she was done being the quiet one. She was done letting them walk all over her. And no matter what happened next, she was going to fight back. The days that followed Mrs. Jensen's unexpected offer of peer mediation felt surreal to Aisha. It wasn't that she didn't want to find a way to make things better, but the idea of sitting down and talking with the very people who had made her life a living hell seemed impossible. Sarah and her friends weren't the type of people who would be willing to listen, and Aisha wasn't sure she could stomach the idea of trying to negotiate peace with them. Yet, despite her resistance, there was a nagging voice at the back of her mind telling her that maybe, just maybe, there was a better way to handle things. After all, wasn't that what Mrs. Jensen had said? Aisha needed to learn to deal with her emotions. She needed to learn how to face her fears and frustrations without letting them control her. But how could she possibly find peace with the girls who had tormented her for so long? It was early Monday morning when Aisha received the official notice. The letter from the school, neatly folded and addressed to her parents, sat on top of her backpack as she walked into the kitchen. Her mother was already sipping her morning tea, as always, the small ritual that started every day with calmness. Aisha, did you see the letter? Her mother asked, her voice soft and knowing. Aisha hesitated for a moment, staring at the letter as if it were some kind of enemy. She hadn't even told her mother about the peer mediation program yet. She wasn't sure how to explain it. I got selected for the peer mediation program, Aisha said, her voice flat. She wasn't excited about it, but she had to tell her mother something. Her mother's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Really? That's unexpected. She put down her cup of tea, her hands clasped together. I didn't think they would pick you for something like this. Aisha felt a pang of frustration. It wasn't that her mother didn't believe in her, it was that everyone seemed to think she needed to be fixed. Like there was something wrong with her for standing up for herself. She wasn't the problem. It was the bullying. It was the world that refused to accept her for who she was. I don't know if I should do it, Aisha admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother gave her a long look, as though weighing her words carefully. It might be a good opportunity to learn how to handle things. But only if you think it's something you're ready for. Aisha nodded, her thoughts in turmoil. Part of her wanted to refuse, to tell the school exactly where they could shove their peer mediation program. But another part of her felt the weight of her mother's words. Was this really an opportunity? Or was it just another way for the school to control her, to silence her? That afternoon, Aisha walked to the school with the letter in her pocket, her thoughts bouncing back and forth between defiance and doubt. She knew that accepting the program wouldn't magically make her problems disappear, but perhaps it would give her a chance to reclaim some of her power. Maybe she could use it as a way to confront the bullies head-on, to make them see that she wasn't afraid anymore. When she arrived at the school, the familiar buzz of conversation in the hallways did nothing to ease her nerves. As she walked to her first class, she passed by the lockers where Sarah and Emily were standing. They exchanged a look when they saw her, their eyes narrowing. Aisha could feel the tension building, but she didn't let it show. She walked past them without acknowledging their presence, her chin lifted with quiet defiance. But Sarah wasn't going to let it go. She followed Aisha down the hall, her voice cutting through the air. "Oh, look at Miss Strong and Defiant," Sarah said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Did you really think you could just show up and start acting all tough?" Aisha didn't stop walking. She didn't even turn around. But Sarah's words followed her, the familiar sting of ridicule sinking deep. "You're nothing but a joke, Aisha. You're never going to be one of us." Aisha's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to turn around and tell Sarah exactly what she thought, but she didn't. She kept walking, faster now, her breath shallow. She knew Sarah was trying to provoke her. She was trying to get a reaction, to make Aisha crumble under the weight of her cruelty. But Aisha wasn't going to let that happen anymore. When the bell rang for the next class, Aisha sank into her seat, her mind racing. It was hard to focus on anything. Sarah's words kept echoing in her head. She knew that she wasn't going to be accepted, not by Sarah, not by any of them. But she wasn't going to stop being herself. She wasn't going to shrink into the background, not anymore. Later that afternoon, Aisha walked into the peer mediation room. It was a small, quiet room at the back of the school, far from the main classrooms. The walls were lined with posters about conflict resolution and the importance of communication. There was a long table in the center, and at one end of the table, Mrs. Jensen sat, waiting for Aisha to join her. "You're early," Mrs. Jensen said with a smile. "That's good. It shows you're committed." Aisha offered a small, forced smile in return. She didn't know why she was there, didn't know what this meeting was going to accomplish. She felt out of place, like she didn't belong in a room full of peace and resolution. As the minutes ticked by, Aisha's nerves grew. She felt the weight of expectation hanging over her. Was she supposed to apologize for standing up for herself? Was she supposed to admit that she had done something wrong? She wasn't sure. Finally, the door opened, and in walked Sarah and Emily, the last people Aisha wanted to see. They looked almost bored, as though they couldn't care less about the program. Sarah tossed her hair over her shoulder as she sat down, not even sparing Aisha a glance. "I don't get why we have to do this," Sarah muttered. "It's just a waste of time." Aisha gritted her teeth, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she focused on the table in front of her, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Mrs. Jensen cleared her throat and looked around the room. "Let's begin, shall we?" she said. "This is a safe space where we can discuss our issues and find ways to move forward." Aisha wasn't sure she could move forward with Sarah and Emily. She didn't think they would ever understand her. But she had to try. For herself. For her own peace of mind. As Mrs. Jensen began asking questions, Aisha listened carefully, trying to keep her emotions in check. The session was slow and uncomfortable. Sarah and Emily exchanged glances, rolling their eyes whenever Aisha spoke. But Aisha held her ground. She didn't back down. "Not this time. I don't understand." "Why you think you can treat me like this?" Aisha said, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "I'm not a punching bag. I'm not here to entertain you." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "And what are you going to do about it? Tell us we're bullies? You're just as much a part of the problem as we are." That was it. The word stung, and for a brief moment, Aisha almost snapped. She wanted to scream, to tell Sarah exactly what she thought of her. But instead, she took a deep breath and focused on the words that had been buried inside her for so long. "I don't want to fight anymore," Aisha said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I won't let you keep treating me like I'm nothing." The room fell silent, and for the first time, Sarah didn't have anything to say. Aisha could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes, but she didn't care. She had said her piece. Aisha sat alone on a bench in the school courtyard, her fingers tightly gripping the straps of her backpack. The weight of the day pressed on her shoulders, and the sunlight, once warm and comforting, now felt distant, as though it were merely an illusion. The voices in the hallway seemed to fade into the background as she closed her eyes, trying to escape the overwhelming noise inside her head. She had made it through the peer mediation session without completely losing her temper, but the tension was far from gone. Sarah and Emily had barely said a word by the end of the meeting, their eyes narrow with silent contempt. Aisha had wanted to believe that something could change, that the session might lead to a breakthrough. But deep down, she knew better. It wasn't going to be that simple. Sarah had mocked the entire process, rolling her eyes and barely hiding her disdain. Emily, as usual, had followed Sarah's lead, acting as if Aisha didn't even matter. To them, she was nothing more than a nuisance, a problem they could easily ignore or manipulate. But Aisha wasn't going to let that define her anymore. The day after the session, nothing had changed. The whispers were louder than ever. Sarah's snide remarks cut deeper, and the mockery was constant. But what bothered Aisha the most was the silence. It was as though her efforts, her attempts to stand up for herself, had only made her more invisible. She wasn't part of their world, nor did she want to be. But it hurt nonetheless. The days dragged on in a haze. The homework, the classes, the brief interactions with her classmates, all of it felt empty. She wasn't sure who she was fighting anymore. Was she fighting Sarah and her clique? Was she fighting the school system that seemed to turn a blind eye? Or was she fighting herself? For the first time in a long while, Aisha felt utterly lost. Later that week, Mrs. Jensen pulled Aisha aside after class. Aisha had been expecting it, ever since the peer mediation session. Mrs. Jensen had noticed her frustration, and it was clear that the teacher wanted to talk. "Aisha, I know this isn't easy," Mrs. Jensen said, her voice gentle but insistent. "You've made it clear that you're not just going to let things slide anymore, but I think you're still holding on to something. Something that's stopping you from fully moving forward." Aisha felt her stomach tighten. She hadn't expected this conversation to go so deep, but Mrs. Jensen's perceptiveness was unsettling. Aisha had been so focused on surviving the day-to-day that she hadn't even realized how much she was still carrying inside. "I'm not sure I know what you mean," Aisha replied quietly, trying to keep the walls up. She wasn't ready to expose herself. Not yet. Not to anyone. "I think you're angry," Mrs. Jensen said, her gaze steady. "I think you're angry at Sarah, at the whole situation. But more than that, I think you're angry at yourself. You're angry that no one is listening, that you're being pushed into a corner, and that no one understands what you're going through." Aisha's heart skipped a beat. Was that what she was feeling? Anger at herself? She hadn't thought about it that way. But as Mrs. Jensen's words hung in the air, Aisha couldn't help but feel the truth in them. She had been angry for so long, but it wasn't just the bullying that made her mad, it was the fact that she felt powerless. Every time she tried to fight back, every time she tried to speak her truth, it was like she was banging her fists against a wall. And that wall was her own fear. "I don't know how to stop being angry," Aisha whispered, her voice barely audible. "Every time I try to stand up for myself, they just laugh at me. Nothing changes. It's like I'm invisible." Mrs. Jensen's expression softened. "That's not true, Aisha. You may feel invisible, but you are not. I see you. I've seen how much you've grown, how much you've changed since the first day I met you. And that's something no one can take away from you." Aisha swallowed, fighting the lump in her throat. She wanted to believe Mrs. Jensen. She really did. But the reality of school, of being constantly ridiculed, mocked, and pushed aside, made it hard to see any light at the end of the tunnel. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," Aisha admitted, her voice cracking. "Every day feels like a fight. Every moment feels like I'm being torn apart." "You don't have to fight alone," Mrs. Jensen said. But you do have to choose to fight for yourself. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be, no matter what anyone else says or does. Aisha looked at Mrs. Jensen, her mind whirling. It wasn't that she didn't know what the teacher meant, it was just that the weight of it all felt like too much to carry on her own. She had always thought that she could handle it, that if she just kept going, eventually the bullying would stop. But it wasn't stopping. It wasn't going to stop unless she did something radical. Something she hadn't done before. Aisha left that conversation with a heavy heart, but also a newfound resolve. She wasn't sure what to do next, but for the first time, she didn't feel completely helpless. The anger, the frustration, it was all still there, but it was starting to feel like a spark rather than a fire. Maybe it was time to use that anger. Not against Sarah, not against the school, but to rebuild herself. That night, as Aisha sat in her room, her thoughts swirled around everything Mrs. Jensen had said. The pressure to be someone else, the desire to fit in, the constant battle with her identity, it all felt like too much. Her mind wandered to her faith, to the strength she drew from it, to the peace it had always given her. But lately, even her faith seemed distant, lost in the noise of school and the cruelty that surrounded her. She sat in front of her desk, pulling out her journal. Writing had always been her escape, her way of making sense of the world. She flipped open to a fresh page and began to write. It's been so hard. Every day, I feel like I'm not good enough. Like I'll never be good enough. But I know I have to be stronger than this. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make them understand, but I can't keep letting them define me. I have to find a way to fight back. To show them who I really am. She paused, the pen hovering above the page as she tried to find the right words. What was she really fighting for? Her dignity? Her peace of mind? Her right to be herself? She wrote again. I will not let them break me. I will not let anyone take away my worth. I may not be like them, but that's what makes me strong. I am not invisible. I am not a joke. I will find my strength, no matter how hard it gets. Aisha closed the journal and placed it on her desk, feeling the weight of her words. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of purpose, a quiet certainty. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to let the world define her anymore. The next day, Aisha walked into school with a new attitude. She didn't walk with arrogance or defiance, she walked with purpose. She walked with the knowledge that she was enough. No matter what Sarah or anyone else said, she knew who she was. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their acceptance. But as she passed through the hallway, she saw Sarah standing by the lockers with Emily. Sarah's eyes narrowed when she saw Aisha, but this time, Aisha didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Sarah took a few steps forward, her lips curling into a sneer. You think you're so special now, don't you? She said, her voice sharp. Aisha stopped in her tracks and faced Sarah, her heart steady in her chest. I'm not special, she said, her voice calm and unwavering. I'm just done trying to be something I'm not. Sarah's expression faltered, her smile twisting into something unfamiliar. What's that supposed to mean? Aisha took a deep breath. It means I'm not going to play your game anymore. I'm not going to let you control how I feel about myself. So keep talking, keep laughing, but I won't be a part of it. For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, Emily following behind her, looking over her shoulder with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Aisha stood there, the silence of the hallway enveloping her. She didn't know what Sarah had been expecting, maybe a fight, maybe a tearful apology, but it didn't matter. Aisha had made her point. She had drawn a line in the sand, and for the first time in a long time, she felt the strength to stand behind it. Aisha woke up with a sense of clarity the morning after her confrontation with Sarah. It wasn't the kind of clarity she had hoped for, it wasn't a resolution that promised everything would be fine. But it was the kind of clarity that made her realize something important. No matter how many times she stood up for herself, no matter how many times she spoke her truth, the world around her wasn't going to change overnight. But she could. She was changing, and that was something no one could take from her. The walk to school that day was different. There was a weight in the air, heavy with tension. Aisha had faced Sarah and Emily before, but there was something about today that felt different. Her confrontation the day before had made things worse, or maybe it had made things clearer. Either way, she was ready. She had to be. As she entered the school gates, she heard the usual whispers from the students standing outside, but she didn't flinch. She had learned to ignore them. But when she stepped into the hallway, she saw Sarah standing with her usual entourage by the lockers, and for a moment, Aisha hesitated. Sarah looked up and locked eyes with her, and that's when she saw it, the challenge in Sarah's eyes. The one that said, "You haven't won." Not yet. Aisha took a deep breath and walked forward. "Hey, look who finally decided to show up," Sarah said, her voice dripping with mockery. "I guess you think you're some kind of hero now, huh?" Aisha didn't respond. She simply walked past Sarah, her body tense, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't need to dignify Sarah's words with a reply. She wasn't here for Sarah's approval. She wasn't even here for the bullies. She was here for herself. The rest of the day was a blur. She managed to make it through her classes without incident, but the weight of the social battlefield she was navigating pressed on her with every passing moment. As much as she tried to focus on the work, her mind kept drifting back to the confrontation. She knew she had to do something. She couldn't keep letting Sarah's presence hang over her like this. She needed to take action. By the time lunch came around, Aisha found herself alone in the cafeteria again. It had become a familiar routine, sitting by herself, pretending to be content. The isolation didn't bother her as much as it used to. In fact, she was beginning to find solace in it. But today, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It was as if the storm that had been brewing for so long was finally ready to break. And it did. As she sat quietly eating her lunch, Sarah and her friends entered the cafeteria, walking with the kind of arrogance that always made Aisha's stomach churn. They spotted her sitting alone and immediately made their way toward her. Well, if it isn't the queen of the losers," Sarah sneered as she stood at the edge of Aisha's table. Emily stood behind her, smirking in a way that made Aisha's blood boil. Aisha's eyes didn't meet Sarah's at first. She could feel the anger rising inside her, but she knew that if she looked up, if she gave Sarah the satisfaction of seeing her reaction, it would only fuel the fire. "Why don't you get up and sit with us?" Sarah said, her voice filled with mock sweetness. "It's not like you have any friends. You're not even worthy of being alone, you know." Aisha took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Her mind was racing. The anger that had been building up for weeks threatened to burst out of her, but she knew that reacting would only make things worse. She stood up slowly, turning to face Sarah. There was a steady determination in her gaze. "I don't need your approval, Sarah," Aisha said quietly, but with a firmness that surprised even her. "I don't need to be a part of your world, and I certainly don't need you to tell me where I belong." Sarah's expression faltered for a moment. It wasn't the usual sneer of superiority. It was something different. Something that resembled uncertainty. "Well, look who finally grew a spine," Sarah said, trying to mask the flicker of surprise. "But you're still nothing. Don't think this little act of defiance makes you anything special." Aisha didn't flinch. She wasn't here to argue or prove herself. She was here to stand her ground, and she wasn't going to let Sarah's words sway her. "I'm not trying to be special, Sarah," Aisha said calmly. "I'm just trying to survive. And right now, I'm surviving just fine without you." With that, She turned away and walked out of the cafeteria, leaving Sarah standing there, speechless. The next day, Aisha entered the school with an even more resolute sense of purpose. It wasn't that everything was fine, far from it. The bullying was getting worse. The whispers, the stares, the insults, it was all getting under her skin again. But this time, it wasn't affecting her as much. This time, Aisha knew something had changed inside of her. She didn't care about Sarah anymore. She didn't care about what anyone thought. She was tired of letting the world dictate her self-worth. As she walked down the hallway, Sarah and her friends didn't even bother to hide their contempt. They were waiting for her, as they always did. This time, however, Aisha wasn't going to let them control her emotions. "Here comes the loser," Emily called out from the other end of the hallway. "Shut up, Emily," Aisha said, her voice steady and calm, yet firm enough to carry through the noise. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The whispers died down, the laughter ceased, and even Sarah looked taken aback. It was as though Aisha had finally found her voice, and she was no longer afraid to use it. The sense of control, of power, was intoxicating. She had always been afraid of confrontation, but now, it felt like a tool, something she could wield when necessary. "You think you can just walk around acting all tough?" Sarah asked, her tone filled with venom. "I don't think anything, Sarah," Aisha replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "I'm not acting. I'm just being myself." The bell rang, signaling the start of class. The hallway slowly filled with the usual buzz of students, but the air felt different now. There was a shift, one that Aisha could sense even though it wasn't immediately obvious. As she entered her class, Mrs. Jensen smiled at her from across the room. It was a simple gesture, but it meant the world to Aisha. Mrs. Jensen had seen her grow, had seen the quiet girl who once struggled to even speak up evolve into someone who could stand her ground. Later that day, Aisha sat down at her desk, exhausted from the emotional whirlwind of the day. Her hand trembled slightly as she opened her notebook, but her thoughts were clear. The girl who had walked into this school at the beginning of the year, timid, afraid, and unsure of herself, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger. Someone who wasn't afraid of confrontation, someone who could face her demons head-on. But it wasn't just about strength. It was about peace. Aisha realized that in her fight to protect herself, she had forgotten what she was truly after. It wasn't about winning. It was about finding the courage to be herself in a world that constantly tried to make her into something she wasn't. That night, she sat in front of her journal again. This time, she didn't write about what she had to do. She wrote about what she wanted to be. "I am not my anger. I am not the words they say to me. I am not the labels they try to put on me. I am me. I will be me. And that will be enough." The words came easily now, like a release. She wasn't going to let Sarah define her anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone define her. Aisha woke up feeling different. The weight she had carried for so long, the invisible burden of fear, frustration, and doubt, had begun to lift. It wasn't gone completely, not yet, but it was lighter now. The anger that had been a constant companion, threatening to consume her, had settled into something more manageable. It wasn't something she could erase overnight, but she had learned how to control it. The confrontation in the hallway with Sarah had changed something within Aisha. It was more than just the words she'd said. It was the fact that she had finally stood up for herself, not with anger or violence, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew their worth. She hadn't needed to shout or fight back. She had simply walked away, secure in the knowledge that she was not the problem. But even with this new sense of peace, Aisha couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. Sarah's gaze still burned whenever she saw Aisha in the hallways. Emily's whispers followed her like shadows. It was as if Aisha had stepped into a new chapter of the battle, and the war wasn't over yet. As she walked through the school gates that morning, Aisha felt the familiar tension creeping back into her chest. Sarah and her friends hadn't let up, and they weren't going to. The whispers still echoed, the stares were still there, but Aisha kept her head high. She wasn't going to back down. She entered the school and immediately noticed the change in the air. There was a subtle shift, something that felt like a storm was coming, but it wasn't the kind of storm that frightened her. It was the kind of storm that would cleanse everything, that would finally tear down the walls that had been built up around her. And then she saw it. Sarah, standing by the lockers with her usual entourage, staring at Aisha. But this time, there was something different in Sarah's eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. It didn't last long, but it was there. Aisha stood at the edge of the hallway, frozen for a moment. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she knew one thing: she wasn't going to let Sarah dictate her day, or her life, any longer. She walked past Sarah without a word, her steps deliberate and unyielding. She didn't glance over, didn't flinch, didn't give Sarah the satisfaction of a response. It was the first time Aisha had walked past Sarah without feeling the sting of humiliation, without the pressure of Sarah's judgment weighing down on her. And it felt liberating. As the day went on, Aisha felt a growing sense of strength. The people who had once whispered about her now seemed to look at her with a mix of confusion and curiosity. She wasn't the same girl she had been when she first walked into this school. She had changed. She had learned how to fight back, not just with words, but with her silence, with her presence. By the time lunch rolled around, Aisha found herself standing alone in the cafeteria, as usual. She didn't mind the solitude anymore. It was a place where she could think, where she could gather herself before the storm that awaited her after school. But today was different. As she walked toward her usual spot, she noticed something strange. Sarah wasn't at her usual table. In fact, Sarah wasn't sitting anywhere in the cafeteria. For the first time in weeks, Aisha found herself looking around the room, unsure of what to do. She was used to being alone, but this felt different. She wasn't sure how to explain it, but something in the air had shifted. It wasn't until the bell rang and the crowd started to thin out that Aisha realized what had happened. Sarah had been called to the principal's office. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. It was the first time in a long while that she had felt a flicker of hope, a spark that maybe, just maybe, something was changing. She hadn't been the cause of Sarah's troubles. She hadn't even been a part of it. But she couldn't help but wonder if Sarah's own actions had finally caught up with her. The next few days were a strange mixture of calm and tension. Sarah didn't make as many appearances in the hallways. She didn't glare at Aisha from across the cafeteria. And for the first time in weeks, Aisha didn't feel like she was walking through the halls of a battlefield. But even in the quiet moments, Aisha knew this wasn't over. The storm had only just begun, and though it felt like the clouds had cleared for now, the sky could change at any moment. It wasn't long before the other shoe dropped. On the 5th day after Sarah's meeting with the principal, Aisha walked into the school to find that the familiar whispers had returned. But this time, they weren't directed at her. They were aimed at Sarah. Aisha tried to ignore the murmurs, but it was impossible. The voices followed her through the hallway, filling the air with speculation, gossip, and judgment. Sarah had been suspended. The reason wasn't clear, but the rumors were rampant. Some said she had been caught bullying another student. Others said it had something to do with her behavior during the peer mediation session. Whatever the truth was, Aisha could see the difference in the way people looked at her. It wasn't sympathy. It wasn't kindness. But it was recognition. The people who had once ignored Aisha now saw her. They saw her strength. They saw the quiet defiance that she had carried with her through the darkness. Aisha didn't want to be a part of the drama. She wasn't interested in watching Sarah's downfall. She didn't care about the rumors. But as she passed the group of students whispering about Sarah's suspension, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of validation. This wasn't the end of the battle. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. But it was progress. It was proof that the world around her was finally beginning to take notice of the quiet girl who had been fighting all along. Later that afternoon, Aisha found herself sitting in the library, trying to focus on her homework. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Sarah's suspension. She couldn't stop wondering what had happened. And then, as if by fate, the door to the library opened, and in walked Mrs. Jensen. The teacher spotted Aisha immediately and walked over to her with a gentle smile. "You seem deep in thought, Aisha," Mrs. Jensen said, sitting down across from her. Aisha smiled but didn't look up from her book. "Just thinking about everything that's been going on." Mrs. Jensen's smile faded slightly. "I know things haven't been easy for you. And I'm proud of how you've handled it. But I also know you're still carrying a lot of weight on your shoulders. It's important to remember that just because one battle seems over, it doesn't mean the war is. You'll face more challenges, and you'll have to decide how you want to face them." Aisha nodded, her eyes still focused on the pages in front of her. "I know. I don't expect it to be easy. But I don't want to be afraid anymore." Mrs. Jensen looked at her with a thoughtful expression. "And that's what matters. Not what others say about you, but what you believe about yourself. Don't let anyone make you doubt your worth. No matter how hard they try." Aisha looked up at Mrs. Jensen, feeling a sense of gratitude wash over her. She didn't need anyone's approval. She didn't need to fit into their world. For the first time, Aisha was beginning to see that she was enough. That evening, as she sat at her desk, Aisha reflected on everything that had happened. The anger, the fear, the bullying, it had all seemed so overwhelming in the beginning. But now, she understood something that she hadn't before. The power to change her life had always been within her. She had always had the strength to face her struggles. The only thing she had needed to do was realize it. She closed her journal and placed it on her desk, a sense of peace settling over her. The storm hadn't passed, but Aisha was ready for whatever came next.